Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Ollie Rehn, who is a former member of the Finnish Parliament and the European Parliament, a leading member of the Centre Party. He is now a research director at the University of Helsinki. Ollie, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you very much.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in eastern Finland, some 100 kilometers from the Russian-Finnish border.
And is that a rural area, or?
That's let's say the area around it is rather rural and dependent on forestry and agriculture, but it is a provincial capital where I was raised and born, called Berkeley. That was the headquarters town of the Finnish armed forces during the Winter War and the Second World War.
So were there a lot of museums and remembrances of that?
There are, yes.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
They did quite a lot. My father was an orphan, and he's a self-made man in business, spare parts and car sales. And as an entrepreneur, he certainly taught me the value of entrepreneurship in life. My mother, in the meantime, she was the first university student of her family, and she became an English teacher. So I read The Economist and the Newsweek at home while at high school. I guess that must have had some impact on my thinking.
Mm-hmm. And what about your career took?
I had a very remarkable history teacher, I would say, who during the time of the Cold War and pressure from the Soviet Union, he was very staunchly, let's say, defending the basic values of the Finnish society, and he was a good liberal who gave us a lot of food for thought for our later life.
And the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the wall must have had a real impact on people in that local community. We'll talk about Finland later, yeah. but so close to the border.
Well, it had not so much immediately, because Finland was a market economy and was part of the West even during the Cold War in terms of its societal system. But of course, after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, the immediate pressure was relieved, and therefore Finland could more freely consider her own future.
And where were you educated, and what was your field of study?
My field of study was political science and economics. I did also some journalism. I studied mainly at the University of Helsinki, but I spent 1 year at Macalester College in Minnesota, in Midwest, and I got my doctoral degree from the University of Oxford, England.
Mm-hmm. And what led you into politics, and when did you enter politics?
Well, I think I had the simple motive of wanting to make the world a better place, both for the Finns and more globally. And one of the first activities I participated some 20 years ago was a solidarity campaign for the African National Congress. And I think one of the greatest moments in my, let's say, historical memory has been the release of Nelson Mandela from prison in South Africa. I can't claim credit for that, of course, but no. Nonetheless it was a very memorable moment.
And what was your first elected office?
My first elected office was, I presume, the chairman of the Finnish Youth Council.
While you were still in college?
I was still at the university, yes. Yeah. Yes. And then I got elected to the Helsinki City Council and later on to the Finnish Parliament.
What would you say is the prerequisite for doing politics? What are the skills required in a democracy like Finland?
I think, first of all, they have changed to some extent. 100 years ago, the leading politicians tended to be university professors. It doesn't unfortunately work that way anymore.
In your country?
In my country, at least,
yeah.
To the same extent. I think the essential thing is that you have core principles for which you are willing to stand. Then, of course, in addition to that, you have to have a quest for knowledge and understanding of the society, so that you know how to influence matters. And then, in the media age, you should be telegenic and be able to communicate in the media as well.
And I assume you must have to listen also a lot to find out what's on people's minds, and so that you can relate the direction you think the society should go with what they're feeling and thinking.
That's right. I think listening to the people is indeed essential. And I think it was Tip O'Neill who once said, there was a foreign policy debate going on. He once said that all politics is local. Mm-hmm. Meaning that we who tend to pay a lot of attention to global issues and European issues, we should also remember to keep a close contact with the everyday life of our citizens. Mm-hmm. And that's what some politicians tend to forget, although I would say that the balance is today reversed, in a sense that politics in the Western countries tend to be even too populistic rather than principled.
And I would imagine that in today's politics, and especially for a country like Finland, you have to look toward the world and the larger regional and other groupings to define your niche.
That's correct, and I would say that for a small state like Finland, that has always been the case. The Finnish fate has been decided by bigger powers very many times in the history. For instance, 1807 by Tsar Alexander and Emperor Napoleon, the Russian and French leaders respectively. And in 1939 by the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov and his German counterpart Ribbentrop, who made a pact and divided the Baltic area and Eastern Europe between themselves. Therefore, it's extremely valuable for Finland to be a member of the European Union, so that you can influence preemptively. You are on those tables where negotiations are held on key security matters in Europe.
And you have been very much involved in this process of linking Finland to the European Union, shaping a new identity in a way for these new times. What were the circumstances under which you first went to the European Union, and what offices did you hold?
I actually started to participate in that debate already when I was at the university, and I was quite active in debating for Finland's EU membership.
And that would have been what year? In
1989, 1990. And then I was policy advisor or chief of staff for the Finnish Prime Minister in 1992-93 during the accession negotiations. And therefore I participated in the entry of Finland to the Union. First and later on after Finland had become a member, I became member of the European Parliament, and I went inside the machinery in Brussels, in a sense.
And you were chief of staff to one of the commissioners also of the...
That is correct. Yeah. After I lost my seat in the European Parliament,
I see.
I was asked to join his staff, and I worked for 4 years as the Chief of Staff for the Finnish Commissioner, Mr. Erkki Liikanen. He is responsible for, well, originally he was responsible for the budget and administration, and for the last couple of years he has held the portfolio of enterprise policy and the information society.
Let's go back to that, original debate in Finland about entering the Union. Tell us a little about those choices and the arguments pro and con for doing that. I mean, it must have been a big decision for your country.
It was, and I would say that there were two key dimensions. The first one was the economic one. Finland faced a very severe economic recession. The Soviet trade disappeared at one night, basically, in 1990. There was a recession in the Western markets, and Nokia had yet not risen to its stardom in the telecommunications industry. Therefore, there was a significant pressure to join the European Union for market access and participation in the broader economic union. The other dimension was, and it's the security policy dimension, and one can say that the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union facilitated Finland's entry to the European Union, because Finland practiced policy of neutrality for several decades after the Second World War. And of course, membership in the European Union was a clear break from that neutrality policy.
What situated Finland to be responsive to these new opportunities that the European Union represented?
I would say that there were several factors. First of all, Finland was a member of the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, which was originally founded by the United Kingdom and several other countries as a counterpart to the then European Economic Community, which is currently the European Union. And more and more members of the EFTA started to disappear from its ranks and join the European Union. And therefore, it was an economic and I'd say also technological necessity for Finland to join the Union. But fundamentally, it was a question of national security and being part of a broader community of nations that has similar values and believes in democracy, liberty, democracy, and market economy.
Now, you said you started out working for your own president as the country was negotiating these changes, but then you went on to the European Union and served in the Parliament and then in the Commission. I'm curious what that experience was like, because you are suddenly thrust in to a situation where you're seeing really the broader picture and a different set of trade-offs. Talk a little about that experience, first as a parliamentarian and then as a member of the staff.
I would say that the European Parliament has the virtue of having naturally a common European view, or as we call a community position. And that's why the European Parliament is an essential player in the European policy-making scene, and in many ways a counterpart of the nation states who often tend to defend their own national interests. In fact, in a similar way, the European Commission is inside Europe. It works for the common European interest, and for instance, it is most often defending smaller member states against the directorate of larger member states. And in that sense, working in the parliament or being a member of the parliament and working in the commission had very similar common European dimension compared to the service in the national administration.
As somebody who had been in politics in your own country, and your own country is a small country, what are the challenges of making your constituents back home feel close to these new super organizations like the Parliament or the Union itself?
It is a major challenge. There is a lot of Euroscepticism in Finland, like in other Nordic countries. And for instance, my political constituency is very multidimensional because the Centre Party is a catch-all party. And just to illustrate you the fact, on the one hand, there are the farmers who are worried of common agricultural policy and how it will deal with the Finnish farmers, while on the other hand there are my cousins and others who work for Nokia as engineers who are naturally part of the European market and have considered membership in the European Union as very beneficial for Finland thanks to the opportunities for its exporting industry. So you have to pay attention to these different constituencies, but at the same time, of course, try to keep in mind that you should work for the best of your country and for that matter for Europe as well.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little now about your political career back in Finland. You were a leader of your party. You've told us a little about the party. What positions did you hold as you worked your way up the Finnish system? You were a member of parliament, correct?
That is correct. Yeah, I was actually a deputy leader of my party, elected to that position in 1988. I think the Centre Party of Finland has the third biggest party congress in the world after the Chinese Communist Party and the Democratic Party of the United States.
An international? You mean the international conference, or
no? International congress of 4,000 people.
Okay.
Roughly. There is a direct vote of rank and file, and you get together in ice hockey.
In Finland, just the Finland party itself. Oh, okay,
right,
all right.
In an ice hockey rink, right? And you get 4,000 people there, and you have a party days for a long weekend, and then on Saturday evening, the night of you have the long knives night, and next morning you vote for the party leadership. So I held the post of deputy leader of the party for 6 years. I lost it mainly because of my pro-European credentials, because the Eurosceptic swing inside the party was quite strong in the middle of the 1990s. I was elected in the Finnish parliament in 1991 from Helsinki, the Finnish capital, and I continued from the Finnish parliament to the European Parliament, where I stayed until the end of 1996, and then had a short spell at the University of Helsinki before entering the service in the Commission for 4 years in 1998.
Let's talk a little about politics in your country as you adjust to these great changes in the world. And there are a number of things that we can discuss. And one of the first things really is this amazing transformation of Finland in turning a company like Nokia from what was, I guess, primarily a forestry product company, a diversified company, but not the diversified technological company that is up there with Microsoft in being on every the name coming out of the mouth of every technologically savvy young person in the world. So, but what here you are, a political leader in your country, involved in various ways in navigating, these processes within Finland to make this leap. What accounts for Finland's success and the role that democratic politics played in that?
I think in many ways it was crucial that in the 1970s and 80s the country was able to foster a strong national consensus behind a strong proactive technology policy and innovation policy, meaning that exactly 20 years ago the technology committee, which was set up by the then government, decided that Finland will invest very strongly on research and development, and all the governments since then have stuck to that position, which have meant that Finland has risen enormously in the statistics of research and development. First, thanks to public sector investment, which then paved the way for private sector investment, which in many ways is behind the story of Nokia, which, as you said, used to produce rubber boots and paper and pulp, while it is now producing wireless mobile communications. So that is one factor, and that has certainly played a key role. But at the same time, one has to recall that Finland is a very dualistic society in a sense that the country has a very strong technology sector, highest proportion of engineers among the university students, while at the same time it has a rather underdeveloped service sector compared to other European countries, and a rather rigid labor market, and these factors together mean that Finland has an unemployment of almost 10% for the moment. Mm-hmm. So what looks nice and thriving from outside doesn't always mean that from inside it would be as excellent as it might look. Meaning that Finland has serious structural problems, and it is a bit like Europe in a microcosm or Germany in a microcosm, meaning that Finland would require structural economic reforms and a revival of entrepreneurship to thrive also in the current century.
So how does the Finnish political leadership, the executive, the parliament sort this out and push the country in a direction that not only continues to benefit technologically, but actually creates a spillover for the rest of the society?
That is a good question, and you have to recall that I'm a member of the party which is currently in the opposition.
I see. So it's not happening. Yeah.
It's just for consumer protection, mm-hmm. To mention this. I think Finland, like many other European countries, face or suffer from a situation where there are no clear policy alternatives. All the parties are too similar to each other, and the power of media is pushing them more and more to please the immediate needs of the political consumers. And there is not enough courage to stand bold for your principles and say that we should reform the Finnish labor market, for instance, or that we should pave the way for more entrepreneurial society. Now,
let's say the Finland attempted to do that, what are the policies that would need to be put in place to do something about the rigidities of the labor market, and what is the opposition to that?
Well, I think I'm a comparative political economist by training, and there are at least two good cases in Europe that have been able to do that. That is to say, the Netherlands and Denmark. They are not without problems either, but both have been able to reduce unemployment from around 15% in the mid-1980s to 3 or 4% in a rather permanent way. And they have done it by improving the flexibility in the labor market and increasing part-time work. These measures are not very popular among the trade unions, which are rather strong in the Nordic countries, and the main opposition comes from the labor unions. Nonetheless, they would be better for the Finnish society and for Finnish employees, Finnish workers, than letting people stand in the door and face a rigid unemployment of 12 to 13%.
Now, does this link to the European Union, this fact that you've been in the inside of that system and moved out and come back to your own, does that help in the problems of political education that must be required to make the changes?
It does to some extent, but the European the European Union doesn't have powers, doesn't have competencies, and perhaps shouldn't have competencies in the field of social policy and labor market issues. And its power is mainly soft power or intellectual power, a bit like the OECD in the industrial developed economies.
But you able to bring that intellectual those ideas to your system to help shake things up, not in a command sense, but in an educational sense?
Yes, I think we have been, and I have been able to do that, but it doesn't mean that these ideas would be accepted in the political debate that easily. There is always opposition to major changes, and that's what we are facing now in Finland. And as I said before, I think in this regard Finland is a rather representative case of old Europe, unfortunately. And the whole Europe would require more dynamism and entrepreneurialism to succeed in the knowledge-driven economy in the future.
And give us an example of what a change toward entrepreneurship in Finland would look like, what a policy would look like, and some of the obstacles there.
Well, Finland has a lot of sound fundamentals in place. It is one of the most advanced information societies. It means that it has good infrastructure for the future digital economy, information society. But at the same time, it seems that there are lots of bureaucratic hurdles to start a business. First of all, setting up of a business takes too long and it is too cumbersome. And secondly, the indirect labor costs are very heavy thanks to high unemployment, which is financed by these indirect labor costs. So what I would do is that I would focus the tax deductions especially in order to encourage entrepreneurship and encourage employability, employing of people, which then would also ease the burden for the welfare state, which indeed is financed by taxes and indirect labor costs.
What are the problems for Finnish politics in making this rather amazing leap as a small state right next to one of the superpowers during the Cold War to a present, and this has all happened in the last decade, to a present situation where your major reference point is the European Union and figuring out how to navigate that. Has that transition from the Cold War world in which Finland is trying to navigate its place to this present situation, what difficulties has that created for a democracy like Finland?
Well, I would say that one question is that the Finns were rather satisfied for the outcome of their neutrality policy of the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and partly understandably, because Finland was not a member of NATO, and there was no security shield from the US side or from Western Europe for Finland, which meant that in the end of the day Finland was alone with the Soviet Union, and we had to deal with the Soviet Union somehow. And I think by and large Finland succeeded rather well in that regard, but at the same time it led many to believe that sort of neutrality policy, staying out of difficulties of the outer world, is a viable policy position in the longer term. I don't think it is. I think Finland is part of the globalizing community, international community, and we have to participate actively in its decision making and give our own contribution.
Now, recently in Finland, you've had something of a in quote spy scandal with regard to the resurrection of memories or partial truths with regard to who did what during an earlier period. Yep. Now, my superficial reading of newspaper articles on that suggests that that old history can become a factor in the manipulation of democratic politics. Is that a fair assessment? Would you agree with that, or?
I think, unfortunately, it is a fair assessment. And the main question is that how should a country like Finland deal with its past, its history during the Cold War? And I think in many ways Finnish policy of neutrality was a success, but at the same time many politicians went too far in appeasement towards the Soviet Union, mainly because they wanted to enhance their position in domestic politics. They used it for mere power purposes, and that's of course not acceptable. In my view, we should rather deal with these matters by methods of critical history writing, historical research, rather than police investigations, especially if these investigations only take one case which is not even a correctly assessed case, while leaving several other cases untouched, seemingly for political reasons, because the chief of the security police has a certain political background that causes significant suspicion of his ability to behave neutrally in this kind of a case.
So what you're saying is that members of the state apparatus, wherever they're located, can selectively leak files or dossiers which can conjure up images of all sorts of things, like someone was a traitor or all kinds of treachery, and in so doing affect the current politics, but at the same time distort the actual historical record.
I would say very much so, and this has been the case in the case of Professor Alpo Rusi, who was there was a suspicion that he would have spied for the East German intelligence services, and that was leaked out last September, and he was standing for candidacy in the parliamentary elections at the same time. I did some investigative journalism in that particular case, and after a few weeks of this leak, I was able to reconstruct the situation in the 1970s. I went to meet and interview the elder brother of this Professor Rusi in Middle Finland, and it turned out that he confessed to me that he had been providing material to an East German and Russian diplomat who were working for the intelligence services all through the 1970s. The material on which this case was based was received in Finland from West Germany via the CIA to the Finnish security police, and apparently there had been the last name of this particular Professor Alpo Rusi, but there had been clearly some sort of a mistake or falsification in this particular case, and now the security police is trying to finish its investigation and conclude the case. I hope it will happen very soon, because there is not a worse accusation than a claim that somebody would have spied for the East German intelligence services, at least in the case of my country. That is the worst accusation you can imagine.
So, and this actually led you to resign from being a candidate for office in order, I guess as a matter of principle, to actually get to the bottom of this.
I had to choose between running for the parliament, we have parliamentary elections in mid-March, or actively start to defend my friend and explore the case. And I wouldn't have watched myself into the mirror if I wouldn't have chosen to create equal conditions of judicial defense for Professor Rusi after the public lynching which he faced in the first few days, first few weeks after the leaks were revealed. The reason why I resigned from candidacy was that I didn't want to harm the chances of my party, because of course these accusations were or would have been linked to the Centre Party in the case I would have continued as a parliamentary candidate.
So I guess we should add courage to what it takes to do politics, both in Finland and elsewhere?
Well, yes, it's, I don't know if it's politics or investigative journalism, but nonetheless...
But you pay political costs, though.
A certain political cost, yes, but I'm quite satisfied with my current job as a university researcher, and I enjoy very much in analyzing the economic transformation that is going on in the Western and other economies for the moment. So let's not exaggerate the cost, but I must say that it's not the easiest thing to do to have a certain tension with the security policy of your own country.
This controversy suggests that even countries like Finland that have had to respond to these great changes might almost need something in the way of a fact-finding commission, a truth and reconciliation commission, to sort of put everything on the table so that whatever is being investigated is in the broader historical context, and not one party other can use it to its advantage in an election where presumably you should be talking about policy issues.
Precisely. I think we have two levels. First of all, in overall terms, we should do some kind of a national self-investigation by using the methods of historical research, so as to discuss openly how far at least some of the Finns went in the 1970s. Not the whole elite, certainly not the people, but some people might have done that. The second level is then the actual espionage, because now we have the East German archives available, and we have other information which has shown that roughly 15 to 20 Finns seem to have worked in a close relationship with the East German intelligence services. I think that should be investigated, but it should be done so that every potential case is dealt with the principles of the rule of law and protection of the privacy of these people, as long as they have not been found guilty. Otherwise, we are in a situation which George Orwell described in his classic The Animal Farm, that some animals are more equal than others. I wouldn't like to live in that kind of a country.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk now a little about the future. You indicated that you worked for the commissioner who part of his portfolio was telecommunications. We've talked about the leading role that Nokia plays in your country, and I'm curious. An enormously important country, an enormously important company in a small country that's trying to position itself for the global economy. What are some of the major policy challenges that you see for Finland in the coming years?
I think Nokia is an interesting case, as we are now in the United States of America. Nokia is owned 80% by US pension funds. So I guess we should rephrase the old saying that what is good for Nokia is good for the United States. So we are in the same boat
Okay.
in a way. I think for Nokia and for the Finnish economy, it is, as we discussed earlier, it is indeed essential that we can revive the spirit of entrepreneurship, and we can have more dynamic labor market. Nokia is a very socially responsible company, and I'm glad that they have retained their major operations in Finland and roughly half of their employees in Finland still. But we shouldn't take that self-evidently that they will forever stay in Finland in the global, as we are facing the global markets. At the same time, I think the Finnish society has a very strong educational and technological infrastructure, which is very useful for Nokia and other small and other, let's say, small and medium-sized companies that Europe and Finland desperately need in order to succeed also in the coming economic transformation.
How important will the competition with Microsoft be for Nokia, companies like Nokia?
It seems it is important, and in a way Nokia is facing US competition in two different spaces. One is the software cyberspace who will define the next generation software rules for wireless mobile communications. And that's where we have some sort of a competition between Nokia and Microsoft. And the other space is China, where China is considering currently between 3 different standards for third generation mobile communications, where the Americans and the Europeans are lobbying very hard, and the Chinese themselves are very hard considering which standard will be best choice for their country. That's important because China is for the moment practically the only significantly growing market and will be so in the next few years. So there are major challenges for a company like Nokia, and they are evidently of a global nature.
And so in the previous era, in the Cold War, I think it was said that Finland went through the Soviets to deal with the world, or always at least had to take that into account. But now Europe is really important. The European Union is really important because it is through Europe that you will negotiate Finnish and Nokia interests in the world economy.
That is correct, and Finland is, in a sense, in an interesting axis between the old and new Europe, in a sense that if we accept the Donald Rumsfeld expression of old Europe, meaning mainly the core of the European Union, i.e. France and Germany, Finland has tried to be at the core of Europe for security and economic reasons, and tried to be close to the major powers. At the same time, Finland is, although it's a Nordic country, but in terms of east-west, it's on the same axis as countries like, or it's actually a bit east of Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary, meaning that for Finland, security considerations still play a role, which was for the Eastern and Central European countries an essential factor when they supported the US position in the current Iraqi crisis. In my view, Finland should work strongly for a continued Euro-Atlantic cooperation for the sake of Europe, and especially for the sake of Finland, because both in terms of economic globalization and security questions, Finland is one of those countries that appreciates the US presence in Europe more than perhaps the French and the Germans do.
So you're suggesting that if we move now to talk a little about foreign policy, that a small country like Finland could play a role that transcends both the old Europe and the new Europe. Is that fair, or do you really, or are you really solidly in the new Europe camp?
Well, I think, let's not exaggerate the role of small states in this kind of a conflict.
We like to do that at Berkeley.
Well, that's nice. That's nice, because even some of the larger states don't count in this particular conflict. In many ways, the key issue is for how long the US will prepare ground for a broad international coalition, and on the other hand, how far France and Germany are willing to go to risk the Euro-Atlantic linkage. It seems that Germany is, in any case, not participating in the possible action in the case of Iraq, but France will play a role in that context. certainly in the UN Security Council. In the Finnish case, I think Finland could play a certain role, and it will have to explore possibilities to play a role at one point or another to repair the damage that has been already happening for the Euro-Atlantic security cooperation.
So both the United States and Europe are very important for your country.
That is correct. That is correct. We have had a discussion on NATO membership in Finland in the recent years, and the government will, or the next government will explore and study the pros and cons of NATO membership in the course of next year, and perhaps come to some conclusions on that. A friend of mine quipped quite a nice point on this matter a week or two ago. He asked me, if Finland were to join NATO, which NATO should it join? and unfortunately, for the moment, there is more than a streak of truth in that quip.
Well, I would guess if either one, it could provide a lot of technological advice on how to counter cyber terrorism. Actually,
that is correct. Yes.
If students were to watch this tape, what advice would you give them in preparing for the future, especially if they're interested in either politics or U.S.-European relations?
I think, first of all, it is important to have an open mind to events outside your own country, and try to study Europe or the US, depending on from which continent you come, or if you come from Asia, the same story. That's one thing. And secondly, I think it is important to construct your own conceptual framework or your insight as to how would you want to world to evolve. What are your principles of building a safer and more prosperous and more ecologically balanced world? And thirdly, I guess it is important to remind everybody that if you are entering into politics, keep in mind the Tip O'Neill saying that all politics is local, and keep a good touch with your constituents, but at the same time try to avoid the trap of populism and stick to your principles.
One final question, and I'm curious, as somebody who's both an academic, has moved in policy circles, but who's actually gone out to listen to the voter, and as Lyndon Johnson used to say, press the flesh with the voter. What conclusions have you drawn about theory and practice, that is, studying politics versus actually doing it?
There are two different discourses in a way. First of all, you have the political science intellectual discourse, which is perhaps it goes deeper, and it is in some senses more honest. And on the other hand, there is the political discourse in the sense of politics rather than policy, where you have to accept certain laws of politics, how you speak to the people, how you simplify, how you make sound bites, and in my view, it's okay if you do that as long as you keep the first discourse in mind, so that keep the policy principles close to your heart, but at the same time understand how politics in the real world really function.
And I guess what makes it possible to survive this, these being essentially in both worlds, is principle.
I think principle and the fact that you have to understand the certain difference between these two different worlds. it's not very easy to combine them, and then you can't do that forever. At some point you have to choose, because in your public appearances you have to be either a strong, skillful, sometimes tactful politician, or you have to be intellectually honest political scientist or academician.
On that note, I want to thank you very much for being here today and really giving us a sense of the day-to-day work of Finnish politics, but also its long-term concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be at Berkeley, which is a very international place.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.